This story isn't going where you think it's going. Sure, it's about a Western man falling for a Thai bar girl in Bangkok, but it's not really about the money, or the lies, or even the heartbreak. It's about how some cities can peel back everything you thought you knew about yourself until you're standing there, exposed, vulnerable, and completely lost. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. I always check the comments. And if stories like this speak to you, there's a super thanks button below. No pressure, just one way to keep these real stories alive. My name is Clayton, and I'm 42 years old. I'm a software engineer from Portland, Oregon, and until 18 months ago, I thought I had life figured out. I had a successful career, a house in the hills, a 15-year marriage that looked perfect from the outside. I was the guy who rolled his eyes at stories about Western men getting scammed by Thai women. I'd see those Facebook posts of a middle-aged divorced guy posing with a girl half his age, talking about real love, while everyone in the comments could see what was really happening. I thought those men were idiots. I thought I was smarter than that. Then my marriage fell apart. Not dramatically, not with screaming fights or affairs, but slowly, like a tire losing air. Jessica and I had grown into strangers living in the same house, going through the motions of a relationship that had died years earlier. The divorce was civil, expensive, and soul-crushing in that uniquely American way where lawyers get rich while families get destroyed. At 42, I found myself alone in a one-bedroom apartment, staring at dating apps filled with women who seemed to view every interaction as a job interview. Portland's dating scene felt like a minefield of expectations, political litmus tests, and emotional baggage. Everyone was guarded, cynical, carrying wounds from previous relationships like armor, including me. So when my buddy Dave suggested I take a trip to Thailand to clear my head, I figured why not? I'd worked for the same tech company for 8 years, had accumulated plenty of vacation time, and frankly, I needed to get as far away from my old life as possible. Thailand seemed exotic, affordable, and most importantly, nothing like Oregon. I booked 3 weeks in Bangkok, telling myself I'd do some sightseeing, eat good food, maybe do some soul-searching on a beach somewhere. I had no intention of getting involved with anyone. I just wanted space to think. Bangkok hit me like a physical force the moment I stepped off the plane. The humidity wrapped around me like a wet blanket, and the city's energy was unlike anything I'd experienced. Portland was calm, organized, predictable. Bangkok was chaos beautiful, intoxicating chaos that seemed to pulse with possibility. I checked into a hotel on Sukhumvit Road, one of those mid-range places that cater to Western tourists. My room overlooked the street, and from my window I could see the city's contradictions playing out below. Street vendors selling pad thai next to luxury shopping malls, Buddhist monks walking past neon-lit massage parlors, businessmen in expensive suits weaving between tuk-tuks and motorcycles. For the first few days I played tourist. I visited temples, took boat rides along the Chao Phraya River, got lost in Chattachak Market, but Bangkok has a way of revealing itself in layers, and by the 4th night I was restless. The tourist attractions felt hollow, staged performances of authenticity. I wanted to see the real Bangkok, whatever that meant. That's how I ended up walking through Nana Plaza on a Thursday night. I'd heard about it, of course Bangkok's most famous entertainment district, 3 floors of bars, music, and nightlife that never seemed to stop. I told myself I was just curious, just observing. I'd have a beer, people watch, maybe talk to some expats who could give me the real story about living in Thailand. The plaza was sensory overload. Neon lights reflected off wet pavement from an earlier rainstorm. Music poured from a dozen different bars, and the air was thick with competing smells. Street food, cigarettes, perfume, and something else I couldn't identify. It felt dangerous and exciting in a way I hadn't experienced since college. I wandered into a go-go bar called Crazy Horse, drawn by the relative calm compared to the chaos outside. The interior was dimly lit, with a small stage in the center where 3 women danced with the mechanical precision of people doing a job they'd done 1,000 times before. I ordered a beer, and found a table in the back, content to observe. That's when I saw her. She wasn't on stages, she was sitting at the bar, talking to another girl, and something about her was different. While the other women in the bar had that hard, practiced look of people who'd learned to see customers as walking ATMs, she seemed softer somehow, more present. When she laughed at something her friend said, it sounded genuine. Our eyes met across the room, and she smiled. Not the professional smile I'd been seeing all night, but something warmer, more real. She walked over to my table, and I noticed she moved differently than the other womenless, performative, more natural. She was beautiful, probably late 20s, with long black hair and eyes that seemed to hold actual intelligence rather than calculated seduction. "You look lost," she said in English that was accented but clear. "I am lost," I admitted, "but I'm starting to like it." She laughed again, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, genuine attraction mixed with curiosity. Not just physical attraction, though that was definitely there, but fascination with another human being. "I'm Chalada," she said, extending her hand. "Clayton," I replied, shaking it. Her grip was firm, confident. We talked for 2 hours. She told me she was from Udon Thani, a city in northeastern Thailand that I'd never heard of. She'd moved to Bangkok 3 years earlier to make money for her family. Her mother was sick, her younger brother was in university, and the opportunities in her hometown were limited. It was a story I'd heard was common, but the way she told it felt personal, not rehearsed. What struck me most was how she listened. When I told her about my divorce, my confusion about what to do with my life, she didn't offer platitudes or try to change the subject. She asked questions that showed she was actually paying attention. In a city where everyone seemed to be performing some version of themselves, she felt authentic. When the bar started closing around 2 a.m., I expected the inevitable proposition: her room or mine, and how much would it cost. But instead, she said something that caught me completely off guard. "I have to work tomorrow night, but maybe we could meet for dinner first? Somewhere, not here. I know a good Thai restaurant that tourists never find." I said yes immediately, and she wrote her phone number on a napkin. As I walked back to my hotel through Bangkok's humid night air, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Not just for sex, though that was part of it, but for the possibility of genuine connection with someone who seemed to see me as more than just another Western customer with money to spend. I should have known it was too good to be true. But that's the thing about Bangkok. It's a city that specializes in making the impossible seem not just possible, but inevitable. The restaurant Chalada chose was exactly what she'd promised: a narrow alley lined with plastic chairs and tables, where the menu was entirely in Thai, and the only other foreigners were 2 backpackers who clearly knew the city better than I did. The food was incredible, spicy and complex in ways that made the Thai restaurants back in Portland seem like pale imitations. But what impressed me more than the food was Chalada herself. Away from the bar environment, she was even more engaging. She asked about my work, seemed genuinely interested in technology, and when I mentioned I'd been thinking about freelancing, she offered practical advice about Bangkok's growing tech scene. She wasn't just beautiful, she was smart, curious, and surprisingly knowledgeable about the world beyond Thailand. "Most men don't expect bar girls to know about software development," she said with a wry smile when I commented on her insights. "Most men are idiots," I replied, and she laughed in a way that made me feel like I'd said something genuinely clever. We talked about everything: her family, my marriage, travel, books, movies. She'd read more English literature than most Americans I knew, and when she mentioned loving Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I felt that rare spark of finding someone who shared my intellectual interests. After dinner, we walked through the quieter streets of Bangkok, away from the tourist areas. She showed me a small temple tucked between apartment buildings, explained the significance of the different Buddha statues, and told me stories about growing up in a rural area where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Bangkok is freedom," she said as we sat on a bench in a small park. "In my hometown, I was always someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's responsibility. Here, I can be myself." I understood that feeling completely. In Portland, I'd been someone's husband, someone's chaladi, someone's expectation. In Bangkok, I was just Claytono history. No baggage, no one else's definition of who I should be. When I walked her back to her apartment building, a modest place in a neighborhood I couldn't have found again without GPSI, expected the evening to follow a predictable pattern. But at her door, she turned to me with an expression I couldn't read. "I don't usually do this," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Date customers. Get involved with men from the bar. It's complicated." I felt my heart sink. Of course. I'd been naive to think this was anything other than an elaborate setup. But then she did something that confused me completely. She kissed me. Not passionately, not seductively, but gently, almost shyly. "I like you, Clayton," she said, "but I need you to understand something. My life is not simple. If we're going to see each other, it can't be like with other men who come to the bars. I need you to respect that I have responsibilities, people who depend on me." I nodded, not entirely sure what I was agreeing to, but certain that I wanted to find out. Over the next week, we fell into a routine that felt surprisingly normal. She worked at the bar most nights, but we'd meet for lunch or early dinner. She showed me parts of Bangkok that weren't in any guidebook, local markets where she shopped, quiet temples where she went to think, rooftop restaurants with views of the city that tourists never saw. What amazed me was how different she was during the day compared to her nighttime persona. At the bar, she was professional, charming in that way that encouraged men to buy drinks and dream about possibilities. But during our afternoon adventures, she was just Chalada funny, thoughtful, occasionally stubborn, in the way that made me want to argue with her just to see her get passionate about something. She told me more about her family, showed me pictures on her phone of her mother and brother. Her mother looked tired but kind, sitting in front of a small house that was clearly modest but well maintained. Her brother was 22, studying engineering at a regional university that Chalada was obviously proud to be supporting. "Education is the only way out," she explained one afternoon as we shared mango sticky rice at a street vendor. "In Thailand, if you're born poor in the provinces, you stay poor unless you're very smart or very lucky. My brother is smart. I got lucky." "Lucky how?" She gestured toward herself with a self-deprecating smile. "I look good enough to work in Bangkok bars. It's not the career I dreamed of, but it pays for his education and my mother's medical bills. In 5 years, when he graduates and gets a good job, maybe I can do something else." The pragmatism in her voice was both heartbreaking and impressive. She wasn't a victim or a gold digger, she was a woman making the best of limited options, sacrificing her own comfort for her family's future. It was noble in a way that made me feel small for ever judging women in her situation. That night, for the first time, she didn't go to work. We spent the evening in my hotel room, talking until sunrise about everything and nothing. When we finally made love, it felt like the culmination of something real, not a transaction or performance. She fell asleep in my arms, and I lay awake watching Bangkok's skyline light up with the dawn, feeling more content than I had in years. I was scheduled to fly back to Portland in 10 days, but I was already dreading it. The thought of returning to my empty apartment, my corporate job, the soul-crushing ritual of American dating seemed unbearable compared to this, whatever this was. That's when I made my first mistake. I started thinking I could save her. It started innocently enough. The third week of my trip, Chalada mentioned that her mother's medication was more expensive than usual that month. Something about the pharmacy changing suppliers. She wasn't asking for money, just explaining why she seemed worried. But when she mentioned the amount 6,000 baht, about $200, I immediately offered to help. "I can't take your money," she protested, but I could see the relief in her eyes. "It's not about the money," I told her. "I care about you. I want to help." She accepted reluctantly, and her gratitude felt genuine. She called her mother that night to tell her the medication was taken care of, and I could hear the older woman's relief even through the phone. It felt good to solve a problem, to be useful in a concrete way. 2 days later, there was another issue. Her younger brother's university fees were due, and the family was short. This time, the amount was bigger, 15,000 baht, about $500, but it was for education, for the future Chalada was working so hard to secure for him. How could I say no? I'll pay you back, she promised. But I waved off the suggestion. Don't worry about it. I want to help. The pattern established itself quickly. Every few days, there was some small crisis that money could solve. Her motorcycle broke down and needed repairs, $300. The roof on her mother's house was leaking, $400. Her brother needed a laptop for his engineering course, $600. Each request came with obvious reluctance from Chalada, genuine gratitude when I helped, and intimate appreciation that felt more real than anything I'd experienced in my marriage. I wasn't just giving money, I was providing security, solving problems, making life better for people I was coming to care about. More importantly, Chalada was giving me something I'd never experienced, the feeling of being genuinely needed. Not for my income or social status or what I could provide long term, but for who I was as a person. She listened to my stories about work with real interest, asked for advice about her own problems, shared fears and dreams that felt too personal to be part of any scam. We were spending almost every day together now. I'd extended my trip twice, telling my boss I was dealing with family issues that required me to stay in Thailand longer than planned. It wasn't entirely a lie. Chalada's family was starting to feel like my family, their problems like my problems. When I FaceTimed with her mother for the first time, the older woman cried with gratitude. She didn't speak English, but Chalada translated her words. She says you're a good man, and she's grateful her daughter found someone who treats her with respect. I was falling in love. Not just with Chalada, but with the version of myself I became around her. In Portland, I'd been Clayton, the divorce software engineer, cautious and cynical and increasingly isolated. In Bangkok, I was Clayton, the provider, the protector, the man who could solve problems and make life better for people who mattered to me. The sex was incredible, but that wasn't what hooked me. It was the way Chalada looked at me when I told her not to worry about money, the way she curled up against me after we'd spent an afternoon helping her navigate some bureaucratic problem, the way she talked about our future together, as if it were not just possible but inevitable. When you move to Bangkok, she'd say not if, but when, I'll show you the real Thailand. We'll travel to my hometown, you'll meet my family properly, maybe we'll start a business together. The idea was intoxicating. I could freelance from anywhere, and Bangkok's cost of living meant the money I'd saved from my divorce settlement would last for years. I could have a life here, a purpose, a woman who loved me for who I was rather than what I represented. I started researching visa requirements, looking at apartments, planning a future that felt more real than anything waiting for me back in Oregon. When friends back home asked about my extended vacation, I found myself talking about Thailand with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found their calling. It's different here, I'd tell them. The people are genuine, the culture values family and respect. I've met someone special. I could hear the skepticism in their voices, but I didn't care. They didn't understand because they hadn't experienced what I was experiencing. They were stuck in the American dating nightmare, while I'd found something authentic and beautiful. By the end of my second month in Bangkok, I'd given Chalada nearly $8,000 for various family emergencies and expenses. It felt like an investment in our shared future, and the gratitude and intimacy it generated seemed to prove that what we had was real. I was planning to return to Portland just long enough to quit my job, sell my apartment, and arrange to work remotely. Chalada and I talked every day about the logistics of my permanent move, the life we'd build together, the family we were already becoming. I'd never been happier or more certain about anything in my life, which should have been my first warning that something was seriously wrong. The beginning of the end started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear. We were in my hotel room on a Tuesday afternoon. Chalada had started spending most of her days there, going to work at the bar only when necessary. She was taking a shower while I worked on my laptop. finalizing the details of my plan to move to Bangkok permanently. I'd already given notice at my job and was in the process of selling my Portland apartment. Her phone rang, and without thinking, I glanced at the screen. The call was from Mama, which is what she called her mother. I'd spoken to her mother several times by then, so I answered, thinking I'd surprise both of them with my improving Thai language skills. But the voice that answered wasn't her mother. It was a man, speaking rapid Thai with what even I could recognize as Bangkok slang rather than the northeastern dialect Chalada's family spoke. I hung up immediately, confused and embarrassed. When Chalada came out of the shower, I mentioned the call casually. "Oh, that was my cousin," she said without missing a beat. "He was using my mother's phone. Family drama. You know how it is." I accepted the explanation because I wanted to, but something felt off. Over the next few days, I started noticing small inconsistencies that I'd previously ignored or explained away. Chalada's phone seemed to ring constantly, and she'd always step away to answer, claiming it was work or family business that would bore me. She was never available on certain afternoons, explaining that she had to run errands or visit friends from her hometown. When I offered to come along, she'd always have a reason why it wasn't a good idea. Most unsettling, other women at the bar started giving me looks I couldn't interpret. Not hostile exactly, but pitying, like they knew something I didn't. When I mentioned it to Chalada, she laughed it off. "They're jealous," she said. "Most of the girls here only meet men who want short time or overnight. They see that you're serious about me, that we have something real, and they're envious." I wanted to believe her, but doubt was creeping in like water through a crack in a foundation. The breaking point came when I decided to surprise her. She'd mentioned needing to visit her sick aunt on the other side of Bangkok, so I thought I'd order food delivery to the address she'd given me, a gesture of care that would show I was thinking about her even when we were apart. The motorcycle taxi driver who delivered the food called me back an hour later, confused. The address was correct, but it was a small apartment building, and no one named Chalada lived there. More concerning, the building manager said no one matching her description had been seen in the area. That night, when she returned to my hotel with stories about her aunt's worsening condition, I confronted her about the address. The look that crossed her face lasted only a split second, but it told me everything I needed to know. For just a moment, I saw panic, calculation, and something else, a disappointment, as if she'd hoped I wouldn't be smart enough to check up on her. "There must have been some confusion with the delivery driver," she said smoothly. "You know how Bangkok addresses or even locals get lost sometimes." But the spell was broken. Once I started looking for inconsistencies, they were everywhere. The sick mother whose medical bills I'd been paying had somehow recovered enough to take a vacation to Pattaya, based on photos I saw on Chalada's phone when she thought I wasn't looking. The brother whose university fees I'd covered was apparently taking time off school to find himself, according to a conversation I overheard her having in Thai. Most devastating was what I discovered about the money I'd been sending. Through careful questioning and some detective work that made me feel pathetic, I realized that most of my financial help wasn't going to family emergencies. It was supporting a lifestyle that included expensive clothes, nights out with friends I'd never met, and payments towards something she kept calling debts without ever explaining what they were for. I felt like an idiot, but more than that, I felt betrayed. Not because she'd taken my money, I'd given it willingly, but because she'd sold me a story about who she was and who we were together, and I'd believed every word. The woman I'd fallen in love with, the authentic connection I'd thought we shared, the future we'd planned together, how much of it was real, and how much was just another transaction in a city built on them. The confrontation happened on a Thursday night, after she'd returned from the bar claiming to have had a slow evening with few customers. I'd spent the day building up courage and gathering evidence, and I was done pretending everything was normal. "I know about Kai," I said as soon as she walked into my hotel room. The color drained from her face. Kai was a name I'd heard her mention on phone calls, always described as a friend from her hometown when I asked. But I'd done some investigating, the kind that made me feel like a jealous stalker but seemed necessary for my sanity, and discovered he was much more than a friend. "What do you know about Kai?" she asked quietly, sinking into the chair by the window. "I know he's not your cousin. I know he's not from Udon Thani. I know you send him money regularly, and I know you've been lying to me about almost everything for 2 months." She was quiet for a long time, looking out at Bangkok's neon-lit skyline. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, smaller, more tired than I'd ever heard it. "How did you find out? Does it matter?" She shook her head slowly. "I suppose it doesn't." What followed was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and it destroyed everything I thought I knew about our relationship. Kai was her boyfriend of 3 years, a Thai man with a serious gambling problem who'd accumulated debts that threatened both their lives if left unpaid. The money I'd been sending for her mother's medical bills and her brother's education had mostly gone to covering Kai's losses and keeping loan sharks from becoming violent. Her mother wasn't sick. She was disappointed in Chalada's choices, but financially comfortable thanks to remittances from an older daughter working in Japan. Her brother was in university, but his fees were covered by a government scholarship program for rural students. The apartment address that didn't exist was where she'd told me she lived, because she didn't want me to know she shared a small room with Kai in a run-down building near the airport, far from the respectable neighborhood she'd described. "Why Kai?" I asked, trying to understand. "If he's causing you so many problems, why stay with him?" She looked at me with something like pity. "You wouldn't understand. He's Thai. We grew up in the same area, speak the same language, understand each other's families. He knows who I was before Bangkok, before the bars, before I learned to perform happiness for foreign men." The word perform hit me like a physical blow. "Was any of it real?" I asked. She considered the question seriously. "Some of it. I do like you, Clayton. You're kind, and you treated me with more respect than most men do. The conversations we had, the things I told you about my dreams, those were real. But the person I was with you, that's not who I am when I'm not trying to make you happy." "And the sex?" "The sex was good," she said with brutal honesty. "But sex can be good without love, and love can exist without a future together." I felt like I was learning a language I'd never heard before, where words like love and future and real meant completely different things than I'd thought. "The money doesn't matter," I told her, and I meant it. "But why lie about everything else? Why create this whole story about your family, your dreams, our future together?" She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Because that's what you wanted to hear. You didn't come to Bangkok looking for a complicated Thai woman with a gambling addict boyfriend and a messy life. You came looking for someone to save, someone grateful enough to love you the way you wanted to be loved. I gave you that story because it made you happy, and making you happy made my life easier." The casual way she said it was somehow worse than if she'd been cruel about it. This wasn't malicious deception, it was professional service, like a therapist helping a client work through their issues, except the payment was in cash and the therapy was an elaborate fantasy. "Do you feel anything for me at all?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, then said something that broke my heart more than any lie could have. "I feel sorry for you." That night, after she left, not dramatically, not with tears or apologies, but quietly, like someone finishing a job, I sat in my hotel room staring out at Bangkok's relentless neon and tried to understand what had happened to me. I'd been scammed, obviously, but not in the way I'd expected. No one had pickpocketed me or run an elaborate con. I'd walked into a transaction willingly, desperate to believe that what I was buying was love rather than performance, authenticity rather than professional emotional labor. The woman I'd fallen in love with had never existed, but the man who'd fallen for her, desperate, lonely, willing to pay any price for the feeling of being needed, he was real, and he was me. Bangkok didn't make me vulnerable, it revealed vulnerabilities that were already there, waiting to be exploited. In the days after my confrontation with Chalada, as I sat in my hotel room trying to make sense of what had happened, I started to understand the psychology behind my own stupidity. I'd come to Thailand, at the worst possible moment in my life. Divorced, alone, questioning everything I thought I knew about relationships and connection. In Portland, dating felt like a series of job interviews where everyone was overqualified and no one wanted the position. The women I met were accomplished, independent, and often more successful than I was. They didn't need rescuing, they needed partners who could match their energy and ambition. But I didn't want a partner. I wanted to be needed. That's the trap Bangkok sets for men like me. It's not about the sex, though the sex is part of it. It's not about the money, though money is the mechanism that keeps the machine running. It's about the intoxicating feeling of being essential to someone else's happiness and survival. In America, I was replaceable. My ex-wife had made that clear by rebuilding her life without me so successfully that our divorce seemed to improve her mental health. My job could be done by any competent programmer. My friends were busy with their own families and careers. I mattered to no one in any meaningful way. But in Bangkok, suddenly I was a hero. My dollars could solve real problems. My presence could bring joy. My decision to stay or leave could determine someone else's future. It was intoxicating in a way that felt like love, but was actually addiction to being needed, to being the solution rather than just another problem. The city enables this fantasy perfectly. Everything is cheap enough that Western salaries feel like wealth. The cultural emphasis on respect and gratitude means that financial help is received with the kind of appreciation that makes you feel like a benefactor rather than a mark. The language barrier creates intimacy through shared difficulty, and the exotic setting makes everything feel more significant than it would back home. Most importantly, Bangkok is full of people who've learned to perform gratitude and affection professionally. It's not malicious, it's survival. But for lonely Western men, the performance can feel more authentic than anything they've experienced in their home countries. I started thinking about the other men I'd seen during my time in the bars and tourist areas. They fell into predictable categories. The recent divorcees, like me, looking for validation, the older guys who'd been passed over by women their own age and were grateful for attention from younger women, the socially awkward men who'd never learned to navigate dating in their home countries, the successful but emotionally stunted guys who were more comfortable with transactional relationships than genuine intimacy. What we all had in common wasn't stupidity or moral weakness, it was loneliness. And Bangkok is designed to monetize loneliness in ways that feel like love. The bar girls aren't victims or predators. They're service providers meeting a demand that exists because modern Western society has created an epidemic of isolated, emotionally starved men with money to spend. They provide companionship, validation, and the illusion of being special to someone beautiful and exotic. It's not evil, it's business. But the business model depends on men like me never quite understanding what we're buying. We have to believe we're different, that our situation is unique, that what we've found is real in ways that other men's experiences aren't. The moment we realize we're customers rather than boyfriends, the fantasy collapses. The tragedy isn't the money lost or even the heartbreak, it's that the underlying need is real. Men like me genuinely do want connection, purpose, and the feeling of making a positive difference in someone else's life. Those are healthy desires. But we've sought them in a place designed to exploit those desires for profit. I thought about my marriage to Jessica, how we'd gradually stop needing each other for anything meaningful. We were comfortable, independent, parallel rather than interconnected. When the marriage ended, neither of us was devastated because neither of us had been essential to the other's happiness or survival. But with Chalada, I'd felt essential. Every problem I solved, every crisis I handled, every dollar I provided seemed to prove that I mattered in fundamental ways. It was intoxicating because it felt like love, but it was actually just expensive therapy for my own insecurities. The cruel irony is that Bangkok can teach you profound truths about yourself, but only after it's extracted a price for the education. I'd learned that I was lonely, that I confused being needed with being loved, that I was willing to pay almost any price for the feeling of significance. But I'd learned these things the hard way, and the knowledge came with shame, financial loss, and the bitter understanding that the woman I'd fallen for had never existed outside my own desperate imagination. 3 days before my flight back to Portland, I ran into Chalada at a coffee shop in Siam Square. She was with a Thai man I didn't recognize, young, well-dressed, laughing at something on his phone. She saw me before I could leave, and after a moment's hesitation, she walked over to my table. "How are you, Clayton?" she asked, and I could hear genuine concern in her voice. "I'm okay," I lied. "How are you?" "Good. Better." She gestured toward the man she'd been with. "That's my brother, the real one. He's visiting from university." I felt a stab of something, not jealousy exactly, but recognition that she had a life completely separate from the story she'd told me, full of people and relationships I'd never been part of. "I wanted to apologize," she said, sitting down without being invited. "Not for taking your money, you gave it willingly, but for lying about who I was." "Why apologize now?" She was quiet for a moment, considering. "Because I've been thinking about what you said, about feeling sorry for you. That wasn't fair. You were lonely, and I took advantage of that. But you weren't the only one who was lonely. This wasn't what I'd expected." "What do you mean?" "Kai and I broke up," she said simply. "The gambling got worse, and I realized I was destroying my life to save someone who didn't want to be saved. I quit the bar 2 weeks ago." "What are you doing now?" "Working at a hotel in the business district. Reception work. The pay is less, but it's," she searched for the English word, "cleaner. More honest." We sat in silence for a moment, watching Bangkok's chaos flow around us through the coffee shop's windows. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. I nodded. The time we spent together, away from the bar, away from the money stuff, some of that was real. "I know you don't believe me, but it's true. You're a good man, Clayton. Kind. The kind of man who deserves someone who loves him for the right reasons. But not you." "Not me," she agreed. "Not because you're not worthy of love, but because I wasn't capable of loving anyone honestly while I was lying about everything else." She reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. "Bangkok breaks people who come here looking for something they can't find at home, but it also breaks people who are already here, trying to survive by giving foreigners what they think they want." I was broken too. After she left, I sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours thinking about what she'd said. The narrative I'd constructed, Western man victimized by manipulative Thai woman, was too simple. We'd both been broken people finding each other in a city that specializes in monetizing human need. Chalada had been trapped by circumstances and limited options, doing what she had to do to survive and support the people she cared about. I'd been trapped by loneliness and the desperate need to feel significant to someone. Bangkok hadn't created either of our problems. It had just provided a marketplace where they could intersect profitably. The money I'd given her, nearly $15,000 over 2 months, hadn't been stolen. It had been payment for services rendered, companionship, validation, the temporary feeling of being essential to someone beautiful and grateful. The fact that I'd believed I was paying for love rather than professional emotional labor was my mistake, not her crime. The real tragedy wasn't the financial loss. I could afford it, and honestly, I'd spent more money on less meaningful things. The tragedy was that we'd both been playing roles that prevented either of us from getting what we actually needed. I'd needed genuine connection and the feeling of mattering to someone who chose to be with me for reasons beyond money. She'd needed stability and the freedom to be herself without performing gratitude for survival. Instead, we'd created an elaborate fantasy that satisfied neither of our real needs while draining us both emotionally and, in my case, financially. I thought about the other Western men I'd observed during my time in Bangkok, the regulars at the bars, the expats who'd been living there for years, the guys who posted endlessly on forums about their Thai girlfriends. How many of them were trapped in similar arrangements, paying for the feeling of being needed while convincing themselves they'd found authentic love? And how many of the women were like Chalada, intelligent, capable people, forced into performing versions of themselves that bore little resemblance to who they actually were, all because the economic realities of their situation left them few other options? The system wasn't evil, but it was profoundly sad. It took people's legitimate needs for connection, significance, and love, and transformed them into transactions that ultimately satisfied no one completely. But here's what I learned in that Bangkok coffee shop. Watching Chalada walk away to rejoin her real brother and her real life. Understanding the system doesn't protect you from it. Knowledge doesn't automatically translate to wisdom, and recognizing manipulation doesn't mean you're immune to it. I'd known, on some level, that what was happening was too good to be true. The rational part of my brain had registered the inconsistencies, the convenient timing of financial emergencies, the practiced way Chalita knew exactly what to say to make me feel special. But I'd ignored those warning signs because I'd wanted the fantasy to be real more than I'd wanted to protect myself from deception. That's Bangkok's real power over men like me. It doesn't trick you into falling for obvious scams. It provides just enough authenticity mixed with the performance that you can convince yourself you're different, your situation is unique, your connection is real. The city breaks men not through elaborate deception, but by giving us exactly what we think we want, while slowly revealing that what we wanted was based on our own delusions about love, need, and significance. I'm writing this from my apartment in Portland, 6 months after returning from Thailand. The same apartment I almost sold to fund my fantasy life in Bangkok. The same job I almost quit to pursue a relationship that existed primarily in my imagination. The same life I'd been so eager to escape. But everything looks different now, because I'm different. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious to casual observers, but fundamentally changed in my understanding of myself and what I actually need from relationships. The hardest truth I've had to accept is that Bangkok didn't break might revealed that I was already broken, just in ways I hadn't recognized. My marriage hadn't failed because Jessica was the wrong woman or because we were incompatible. It had failed because I'd never learned the difference between being needed and being loved, between providing value and receiving genuine affection. I'd confused codependency with intimacy, and when Jessica grew strong enough not to need rescuing, I'd felt unimportant rather than proud. When she became successful enough to handle her own problems, I'd felt useless rather than supportive. I'd mistaken her independence for rejection instead of recognizing it as the natural evolution of a healthy person. Those same broken patterns had made me the perfect mark for Bangkok's emotional marketplace. I'd arrived in Thailand carrying 15 years of unexamined insecurities about my worth as a partner, and the city had provided a woman willing to perform gratitude and dependence in exchange for financial support. The tragedy isn't that Chalada took advantage of my loneliness, it's that I was so disconnected from my own emotional needs that I couldn't tell the difference between being genuinely loved and being professionally managed. Bangkok breaks men who arrive already broken, men who've never learned to find significance outside of being needed by someone else. The city doesn't create these vulnerabilities, it exploits them with surgical precision. But here's what I wish someone had told me before I got on that plane to Thailand. The problem isn't Thai women, bar culture, or even the economic desperation that drives the sex tourism industry. The problem is Western men who've grown up in a culture that teaches us to equate our worth with our ability to provide, protect, and solve problems for others. We're raised to believe that love is something we earn through usefulness, rather than something we deserve simply for being human. When that belief system encounters an environment where usefulness can be purchased, where gratitude and affection are available for the right price, we become vulnerable in ways we don't even recognize. The men who successfully navigate Bangkok's temptations aren't necessarily stronger or smarter than those who don't. They're usually men who already have a solid sense of their own worth that doesn't depend on being needed by someone else. They can enjoy the city's pleasures without confusing transaction with love because they don't need external validation to feel valuable. I've started therapy since returning to Portland, real therapy, not the expensive kind I was buying in Bangkok bars. I'm learning to recognize the difference between healthy interdependence and desperate codependency. I'm working on finding significance through my own achievements and relationships rather than through my ability to rescue others. And I'm dating again, but differently. I'm looking for women who want me rather than need me, who choose to be with me because they enjoy my company rather than because I can solve their problems. It's harder than the Bangkok model, but it's also more honest. The apps are still frustrating, the Portland dating scene is still challenging, and I'm still learning to navigate relationships with women who don't need rescuing. But at least now I know what I'm actually looking for. Partnership rather than dependency, mutual choice rather than financial obligation, love rather than performed gratitude. Bangkok taught me that I have a savior complex, that I confuse being needed with being loved, and that I'm willing to pay almost any price for the feeling of significance. Those were expensive lessons, but they were lessons I needed to learn. The city didn't break mate, held up a mirror, and showed me exactly who I was. The breaking came from recognizing that the man in the mirror wasn't who I thought I was, and that the love I thought I'd found was actually just a reflection of my own desperate need to feel important. If you're reading this and planning a trip to Thailand, or if you're already there and falling for someone who seems too good to be true, I'm not going to tell you not to go or not to fall. Bangkok is an incredible city with amazing people, and not every cross-cultural relationship is doomed to exploitation. But I will tell you this. Before you try to save someone else, make sure you understand what you're trying to save them from. Before you invest in someone else's dreams, make sure you have dreams of your own that don't depend on being needed. Before you fall in love with gratitude, make sure you know the difference between appreciation and affection. And most importantly, remember that any city that promises to give you everything you think you want is probably planning to show you everything you never knew you lacked. Bangkok doesn't break men who fall for Thai bar girls. Bangkok reveals men who were already broken, just well enough to function until they encountered a place that knew exactly how to monetize their brokenness. The question isn't whether you're too smart to fall for obvious scams. The question is whether you're honest enough with yourself to recognize when you're buying something you desperately want to believe is being given freely. I learned the answer to that question the hard way. But I learned it, and that education, expensive as it was, might have been the best investment I made during my time in the land of smiles. Even if I didn't understand the price I was paying until long after I'd agreed to pay it,